The sun sets, and the city transforms. The crowds vanish, the lights hum, and the silence takes over. This is the graveyard shift, where the buildings are empty, but the danger is full. In this series, we explore the crimes that happen when the world is asleep, and only the watchmen are left to face the dark. But tonight, we enter a different kind of darkness. We enter the places where the sick and vulnerable lie in beds, trusting strangers with their lives. We enter the hospitals, and we meet the people who turned healing into horror. We trust them with our lives. When we are at our weakest, sickest, and most vulnerable, we close our eyes and hope they are watching over us. We trust the nurse who checks our vitals at 3 a.m. We trust the orderly who brings us water. We trust the respiratory therapist who adjusts our oxygen. We have no choice but to trust them. But in the quiet hours of the hospital night shift, some caregivers aren't fighting death, they are bringing it. Tonight, we're unlocking the stories of the medical professionals who broke their oath in the bloodiest way possible. From the high-security labs of Yale to the critical care wards of New Jersey, from the sprawling chaos of Bellevue to the sterile respiratory units of California, these are the people who wore scrubs and stethoscopes while committing murder. The buildings are full of patients, but the danger walks the halls in a white coat. Let's begin. The Shadow in the Ward. The Crimes of Charles Cullen, the Good Nurse. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, 1988, 2003. There's something uniquely terrifying about a killer who operates in plain sight, who walks the hallways of a hospital with a badge and a purpose, who checks your IV bag with a smile and leaves you dying without anyone noticing. Charles Cullen was that killer. And for 16 years, he moved through hospitals in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, murdering patients with such efficiency and subtlety that he became, by most estimates, the most prolific serial killer in American history. His body count is staggering. Cullen confessed to murdering at least 29 patients, but investigators believe the true number is closer to 400. 400 lives. 400 people who checked into hospitals expecting to be healed, who trusted the nurses watching over them, who closed their eyes for the night and never woke up. And the most horrifying part, the hospitals knew, or at least they suspected, and they did nothing. Charles Cullen was a critical care nurse who worked the night shift, the graveyard hours when staffing was thin and supervision was minimal. And in that calm, he killed. Cullen's career began in 1987 at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. Within months, patients on his ward began experiencing unexplained cardiac arrests. Elderly patients mostly, or those already in critical condition, the kind of deaths that don't immediately raise red flags. But then, the pattern became pronounced. Cardiac arrests were happening almost exclusively on Cullen's shifts. Statistical analysis, done later, would show that the mortality rate on Cullen's shifts was significantly higher than the hospital average. But in the moment, these patterns are easy to miss, or easy to ignore. During the night shift, hospitals are different. Staffing drops, fewer nurses per patient, fewer supervisors on duty. The attending physicians go home, and the nurses working overnight have a degree of autonomy that doesn't exist during the day. For Charles Cullen, that autonomy was a weapon. Cullen's method was insidious. He would access the hospital's medication dispensary and obtain drugs like digoxin and insulin. Then, during his shifts, he would inject lethal doses into patients' IV lines. Digoxin, in therapeutic doses, regulates heart rhythm. In large doses, it's a poison that causes fatal arrhythmias. The heart stops. Insulin, used to manage diabetes, can cause catastrophic drops in blood sugar leading to seizures, coma, and death. Both drugs are common in hospitals. Both are easy to access. And both, when they cause death, can look like natural complications, especially in patients who are already sick. Cullen knew this. He exploited it. And for years, he got away with it. But the deaths at St. Barnabas were noticed by some. Nurses whispered. Colleagues questioned. Why were so many patients crashing on Cullen's shifts? In 1992, the hospital conducted an internal review. They found irregularities. The evidence pointed toward Charles Cullen, but St. Barnabas didn't call the police. They didn't fire Cullen publicly. Instead, they allowed him to resign quietly and move on to the next hospital. This decision would have deadly consequences. The pattern repeated itself over and over for 16 years. Cullen worked at Warren Hospital, Hunterdon Medical Center, Morristown Memorial Hospital, and Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey, as well as hospitals in Pennsylvania. At each facility, patients died unexpectedly on his shifts. Suspicions arose, and hospitals allowed Cullen to resign and move on. It's a phenomenon called passing the trash. Institutions quietly shuffling problematic employees to other facilities rather than dealing with investigation and termination. But passing the trash meant passing along a serial killer. Every time a hospital allowed Cullen to resign quietly, they condemned patients at his next facility to death. You might wonder why the hospitals made this choice. The answer is cold and calculated: liability and reputation. Acknowledging that a serial killer worked in their facility opens them to lawsuits, regulatory scrutiny, and loss of community trust. So, 10 hospitals chose to quietly push the problem elsewhere, and hundreds of patients paid with their lives. It wasn't until 23 that the pattern was broken. Not because a hospital acted decisively, but because one nurse had the courage to speak up. Amy Lauren worked alongside Cullen at Somerset Medical Center and had developed what she thought was a friendship with him. But Amy noticed the deaths. She noticed that when Cullen was on shift, codes were called more often. In late 2003, a patient named Reverend Florian Gall died unexpectedly. His family demanded an investigation. Somerset Medical Center finally launched a formal internal investigation and found that someone had been accessing medications inappropriately. The access logs pointed to Charles Cullen. Investigators asked Amy to wear a wire and engage Cullen in conversation. Over several days, Cullen began to admit to his crimes. He said he had hurt patients. He was vague, but the admissions were there. On December 12, 2003, Charles Cullen was arrested. When confronted, he began to confess. At first, a handful of patients, then a dozen, then 29. But investigators believe that's only a fraction of the true number. Working with forensic experts, law enforcement analyzed mortality rates at every hospital where Cullen had worked. At some hospitals, the mortality rate on Cullen's shifts was 3 to 4 times higher than average. Extrapolating from these patterns, investigators estimated that Cullen had killed between 300 and 400 patients over his 16-year career. That would make him the most prolific serial killer in American history. Cullen was charged with 22 murders and 3 attempted murders. He pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences. At his sentencing, Cullen showed little emotion. He claimed he was ending suffering, acting out of mercy. But investigators found this explanation hollow. Many of his victims weren't terminally ill. They were recovering, expected to go home. The more likely explanation is that Cullen was motivated by control, by a God complex, and by a need to decide who lived and who died. The families of Cullen's victims have filed lawsuits against the hospitals. Some settled, others went to trial, but no amount of money can bring back the murdered. The case led to reforms. Many states now have mandatory reporting requirements. If a healthcare facility suspects an employee is harming patients, they must report it. Background checks are more thorough. Medication systems are more tightly controlled. But these changes came too late for the 400 patients Charles Cullen murdered. The shadow in the ward is the ultimate nightmare. When you check into a hospital, you surrender control. You trust the nurse who checks your IV. But for hundreds of patients, that nurse was Charles Cullen. And instead of healing them, he was killing them. Charles Cullen's story has been told in books and a film titled The Good Nurse. The film highlights Amy Lauren's courage and the institutional failures, the hospitals that knew and did nothing. Cullen is now in his 60s, serving life in New Jersey State Prison. He will die there. But the families of his victims live with the knowledge that their loved ones were murdered by someone who was supposed to care for them. And the question that haunts this case is, how many other Charles Cullens are out there, operating in the quiet hours of the night shift? We may never know. The Lab Rat Mystery. The Murder of Annie Lett. Yale University, New Haven, CT. September 8, 2009. There are few places that feel as secure as a modern research facility. Keycard access, security cameras, restricted entry. It's designed to keep the outside world out. But the problem with a secure facility is that once you're inside, you're locked in with everyone else who has access. And sometimes, the danger isn't outside trying to get in. It's already inside. Annie Le was a 24-year-old doctoral student in pharmacology at Yale University. She was brilliant, driven, and days away from her wedding. On September 8, 2009, Annie walked into the Amistad Street Research Building at Yale to work on her experiments. And she never walked out alive. Annie had earned her undergraduate degree with a perfect 4 GPA. She was conducting cutting-edge research at Yale, and she was engaged to Jonathan Wadowski. Their wedding was scheduled for September 13, just 5 days away. On September 8, Annie arrived at the Amistad Street Building around 10 a.m. Security footage captured her entering, swiping her keycard. She looked calm, focused. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. The Amistad building houses research laboratories, where scientists conduct experiments on animals. Security is tight, keycard access, cameras monitoring hallways. The work is important but controversial, which is why security is so strict. Annie's lab required her to go to the basement level, where mouse colonies were housed. Security logs show she swiped her keycard to access the basement around mid-morning. But she never swiped out. According to electronic logs, Annie entered the building and never left. By early evening, Annie's fiancé Jonathan was worried. She was supposed to meet him, but she hadn't shown up. He tried calling. No answer. This wasn't like Annie. By the next morning, Yale University police were involved. They checked the keycard logs. Annie had entered, but never exited, which meant she was still inside. Yale police, the New Haven Police Department, and the FBI launched a massive search. They went floor by floor, room by room, checking every space. They brought in search dogs. They interviewed everyone in the building on September 8. The search took days. September 13 arrived, Annie's wedding day. Instead of celebrating, her family held vigils. And on September 13th, investigators found her body. Behind a wall panel in the basement, hidden in a narrow utility space, they found Annie Le. She had been strangled. Her body had been concealed there for 5 days while investigators searched. The investigation focused on who had been in the building. Security logs provided a list, and one name kept surfacing: Raymond Clark III. Clark was a 24-year-old lab technician who cared for research animals. He had been in the building on September 8. He had access to the areas where Annie worked. Detectives learned that Clark had clashed with Annie over lab protocols. He was obsessive about procedures, and he believed Annie wasn't following them correctly. To most, these were minor workplace disputes. But for Clark, they became an obsession. Investigators believe Clark confronted Annie in the basement on September 8. The confrontation turned violent. He strangled her, then hid her body behind the wall panel. He went about his day as if nothing had happened. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Annie's blood and hair were found on items linked to Clark. Security footage placed him in the areas where Annie disappeared. An analysis showed he had been cleaning, removing evidence. On September 17th, Raymond Clark was arrested. Faced with the evidence, he eventually pleaded guilty to murder and attempted sexual assault. He was sentenced to 44 years in prison. At his sentencing, Clark showed little emotion. He claimed he hadn't intended to kill Annie, but the premeditation in hiding her body suggested otherwise. Annie's family and fiancé spoke at the sentencing. Jonathan described planning a wedding and a funeral in the same week. Annie's mother talked about the graduate degree her daughter would never complete, the discoveries she would never make, and they spoke about the betrayal. Annie had been killed in a place that was supposed to be safe by someone who was supposed to be a colleague. You might wonder how this could happen in a high-security facility. The answer is that security systems keep unauthorized people out. But once you're authorized, once you have a badge, you're trusted. Raymond Clark had every right to be in the building. He knew the layout, the schedules, the blind spots. He knew about the utility spaces, and he used that knowledge to commit murder. The locked room aspect is what makes this so chilling. Annie wasn't killed in a dark alley. She was killed inside one of the most secure buildings on one of the most prestigious campuses in the world. Security is an illusion. It makes us feel safe, but it can't protect us from the people who are already inside. Yale implemented additional security measures after Annie's murder. More cameras, enhanced training, protocols for workplace conflicts. But these changes came too late for Annie. She was a rising star, a woman on the verge of a beautiful future. The Amistad building still operates. Research continues, but the memory lingers, a reminder that security is fragile, that trust can be betrayed, and that danger can wear a familiar face. Annie Lowe would be 40 now. She would have completed her PhD, contributed to medical research, married Jonathan, possibly had children. Instead, she's frozen at 24, forever the brilliant student murdered days before her wedding. Raymond Clark is serving his sentence. He will likely never be released. He has shown little remorse, provided no real closure. The lab rat mystery isn't really a mystery. We know who killed Annie Lee. We know how. But what we don't know is why. Why did Clark decide a workplace dispute was worth killing for? The answers are locked inside a killer who has chosen silence. Annie Lee was 5 days from her wedding. She was working in a secure building. And she was murdered by a coworker who decided his petty grievances were more important than her life. The secure facility couldn't protect her. The cameras couldn't stop it. Because the danger wasn't trying to break in. It was already inside, wearing a badge, walking the same halls, and waiting for the moment to strike. The Bellevue Intruder. The murder of Dr. Kathryn Hinnant. Bellevue Hospital, NYC. January 7th, 1989. Bellevue Hospital is a New York City institution. Founded in 1736, it's the oldest public hospital in the United States, a sprawling complex of buildings on the east side of Manhattan that has treated everyone from presidents to paupers, from celebrities to the homeless. It's a place of legends and contradictions, a world-class medical facility that also serves as the emergency room for a city that never sleeps, a teaching hospital affiliated with NYU that also operates a psychiatric ward, famous for housing some of the city's most troubled minds. During the day, Bellevue is a hive of activity. Thousands of patients pass through its doors. Medical students make rounds. Nurses navigate crowded hallways. The emergency room pulses with the chaos of urban trauma, gunshot wounds, overdoses, heart attacks, the endless parade of human suffering that defines a major city hospital. But at night, Bellevue transforms. The crowds thin, the hallways empty, and in the quiet spaces, the offices, the labs, the research wings, staff members work late, alone, trying to finish projects, prepare presentations, conduct research without the distractions of daytime chaos. Dr. Kathryn Hinnant was one of those people. On the evening of January 7th, 1989, she was working late in her office at Bellevue, preparing for a presentation she was scheduled to give the following week. She was a pathologist, a researcher, a dedicated physician who had devoted her career to understanding disease and helping others. She was 33 years old, and on that Saturday night, while she worked alone in her office, a man who had been living in the hospital's utility tunnels, wearing a stolen lab coat and posing as a doctor, walked through her door. His name was Stephen Smith, and he was there to rob, rape, and kill her. Kathryn Hinnant had earned her medical degree from the State University of New York. She had completed her residency in pathology and had chosen to work at Bellevue because of its reputation, its connection to NYU's medical school, and its mission to serve all New Yorkers regardless of their ability to pay. She believed in public health, in accessible medicine, and using her skills to help the most vulnerable populations. Her work was challenging, often frustrating. Bellevue was chronically underfunded, overcrowded, and stretched to its limits. But Kathryn found meaning in it. She loved teaching medical students, conducting research, contributing to the body of medical knowledge that saved lives. On the evening of January 7th, Kathryn stayed late at the hospital. It was a Saturday, and the building was quieter than usual. Fewer staff, fewer patients in the administrative and research wings. She was in her office on one of the upper floors, surrounded by medical journals, slides, research papers. She was preparing a presentation on pathology findings, the kind of detailed, technical work that requires concentration and solitude. She had no way of knowing that she wasn't alone, that someone was watching. that someone had been living in the shadows of Bellevue for weeks, moving through the tunnels and utility spaces, stealing food from the cafeteria, taking lab coats and ID badges, blending in with the hospital staff. Stephen Smith was 31 years old, homeless, and had a history of mental illness and criminal behavior. He had been arrested multiple times for petty crimes, had cycled through the city's shelter system, and had eventually found his way to Bellevue, not as a patient, but as a squatter. Bellevue, like many large urban hospitals, has a labyrinth of utility tunnels, mechanical rooms, and service corridors beneath and between its buildings. These spaces are necessary for the infrastructure of a massive hospital. Steam pipes, electrical systems, water mains, ventilation ducts. But they also provide hiding places for people who don't want to be seen. Smith had been living in these tunnels. He knew the layout of the hospital, knew where security was lax, knew how to move through the building without attracting attention. And he had stolen a white lab coat, the universal symbol of medical authority. With the coat on, he could walk through Bellevue's hallways, and most people wouldn't question his presence. He looked like a doctor. He acted like he belonged. And on the night of January 7th, he used that stolen identity to gain access to Kathryn Hinnant's office. The exact timeline of the attack has been reconstructed through forensic evidence and Smith's eventual confession. Sometime in the late evening, investigators estimate between 8 and 10 p.m., Stephen Smith entered the research wing of Bellevue Hospital. He was wearing the stolen lab coat, and to anyone who saw him, he would have looked like a physician making late rounds or heading to a research lab. He encountered no resistance. No one stopped him to ask for ID. No one questioned why he was there. In a hospital as large and chaotic as Bellevue, people in white coats are assumed to belong. Smith made his way to Kathryn Hinnant's office. Whether he targeted her specifically, or whether her office was simply in his path is unclear. But when he entered, he found her alone, working at her desk, surrounded by the materials of her research. Smith attacked her. The initial assault was a robbery. He demanded money, valuables, anything she had. Kathryn likely complied, handing over her wallet, her jewelry, anything to make him leave. But Smith didn't leave. He sexually assaulted her. And then, to eliminate the witness who could identify him, he strangled her to death. Kathryn Hinnant fought. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms showed that she struggled, that she tried to protect herself. But Smith was larger, stronger, and driven by a combination of desperation and violence that overpowered her. When it was over, Smith took Kathryn's belongings and fled. He stripped off the lab coat, disappeared back into the utility tunnels, and vanished into the vast underground network beneath Bellevue Hospital. Kathryn's body was discovered later that night by a security guard making rounds. The scene was immediately recognized as a homicide. Then NYPD was called, and detectives from Manhattan's Homicide Division arrived to process the crime scene. The murder of a doctor inside one of New York City's most iconic hospitals sent shockwaves through the medical community. If a physician wasn't safe working late in her own office in a hospital, where was anyone safe? The investigation was immediate and intensive. Detectives interviewed everyone who had been in the building that night: staff, security guards, patients, visitors. They processed the crime scene, collecting forensic evidence, fingerprints, DNA, fibers. They reviewed security logs and footage, though Bellevue's security system in 1989 was far less comprehensive than modern systems. Witnesses reported seeing a man in a white lab coat in the research wing around the time of the murder. But descriptions were vague. A black man, medium build, wearing a lab coat. In a hospital where dozens of doctors fit that description, it wasn't enough to narrow down the suspect pool. The breakthrough came when detectives learned about the homeless population living in and around Bellevue. Hospital security and social workers were aware that people sometimes sought shelter in the hospital's utility tunnels, that the vast infrastructure of the complex provided hiding places for those with nowhere else to go. Detectives began searching the tunnels, and they found evidence of habitation, makeshift sleeping areas, stolen food, discarded clothing. And they found a white lab coat, stained with what appeared to be blood. The coat was sent to the forensic lab. DNA analysis, still relatively new in 1989, linked the blood to Kathryn Hinnant, and fingerprints on the coat matched prints found at the crime scene. Now investigators had physical evidence. What they needed was a suspect. Tips began coming in from hospital staff and security, who had noticed a man matching the description of the suspect lingering in the hospital. wearing lab coats at odd times, acting in ways that seemed off. One security guard remembered seeing a man in a lab coat who didn't have an ID badge. Unusual, but not unheard of in the chaos of a large hospital. Detectives compiled a composite sketch based on witness descriptions. The sketch was circulated to NYPD officers, to hospital security, and to the media. And within days, someone recognized the face. Stephen Smith had been arrested previously for minor crimes. His fingerprints were in the system, and when investigators compared the prints from the lab coat and the crime scene to Smith's prints on file, they got a match. An arrest warrant was issued. NYPD officers fanned out across Manhattan, searching shelters, known homeless encampments, and the areas around Bellevue where Smith had been seen. On January 18, 1989, 11 days after Kathryn Hinnant's murder, Stephen Smith was apprehended in a subway station. When confronted, Smith initially denied involvement, but the forensic evidence was overwhelming. His fingerprints were at the crime scene. Kathryn's blood was on the lab coat he had worn. And when detectives searched him, they found items belonging to Kathryn. Her wallet, her watch. Faced with the evidence, Smith eventually confessed. He admitted to living in the tunnels beneath Bellevue. He admitted to stealing the lab coat. He admitted to entering Kathryn Hinnant's office, to robbing her, to assaulting her, to strangling her to death. His motive, as he described it, was robbery. He needed money. He thought a doctor would have cash, valuables. The sexual assault and the murder, he claimed, had escalated from the initial robbery. But investigators saw through the rationalization. The level of violence, the decision to rape and kill rather than simply flee with the stolen items, these weren't the actions of a desperate man caught in a moment of panic. They were the actions of a predator who saw an opportunity and took IT. Stephen Smith was charged with murder, rape, and robbery. The trial was relatively swift. The forensic evidence was damning. Fingerprints, DNA, stolen property. Smith's own confession sealed his fate. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. He was sent to New York State's correctional system, where he remains to this day. But the conviction didn't undo the damage. Kathryn Hinnant was still dead. Her family was still grieving, and the medical community was still grappling with the realization that working late in a hospital, a place dedicated to healing, could be deadly. You might wonder how someone could live in the tunnels of a hospital for weeks without being detected. How could Stephen Smith move through Bellevue, stealing lab coats, posing as a doctor, and no one stopped him? The answer lies in understanding the nature of large urban hospitals. Bellevue is a vast, sprawling complex. It employs thousands of people. It treats hundreds of thousands of patients every year. It's a city unto itself, with its own infrastructure, its own ecosystems, its own chaos. In that environment, people fall through the cracks. A man in a white lab coat, walking with purpose, doesn't raise alarms. Security guards see hundreds of doctors every shift. They can't possibly know everyone who works in the hospital. And the utility tunnels, dark, labyrinthine, tucked away from public view, are places where someone who wants to hide can do so for extended periods. Smith exploited all this. He used the chaos of the hospital to blend in. He used the stolen lab coat to project authority. And he used the isolation of the late night hours to find a victim who was alone, vulnerable, and unable to call for help in time. The murder of Dr. Kathryn Hinnant led to changes at Bellevue and at hospitals across New York City. Security was increased, particularly in research and administrative wings where staff often worked alone. ID badge systems were strengthened. Physicians were required to wear visible identification at all times, and security guards were trained to challenge anyone who couldn't produce proper credentials. Access to utility tunnels and service corridors was restricted and monitored more closely. Hospitals acknowledged that these spaces, while necessary for infrastructure, could also provide hiding places for people with malicious intent. But these changes came too late for Kathryn. She had dedicated her life to medicine, to helping others, to contributing to the body of knowledge that saves lives. And she was murdered by a man who saw her not as a healer, not as a person, but as a target. Kathryn Hinnant's family has spoken over the years about the devastating impact of her loss. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She was a doctor who had so much more to contribute. And she was killed in a place that was supposed to be a sanctuary, a hospital. The irony is almost unbearable. Hospitals are where people go to be saved, to be healed, to be protected from death. But for Kathryn Hinnant, the hospital became the place where she died, attacked by a man who had been living in its shadows, wearing its uniform, hiding in plain sight. Bellevue Hospital continues to operate as one of New York City's essential medical institutions. It has been renovated, expanded, and modernized in the decades since Kathryn Hinnant's murder. But the memory of what happened to her remains, a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of those who work late, who dedicate themselves to their professions, who assume that the buildings where they work are safe. The utility tunnels are still there, beneath and between the hospital's buildings. They're necessary for the functioning of a complex this size. But they're monitored now, secured, no longer the open hiding places they once were. Stephen Smith is now in his 60s, serving his sentence in a New York state prison. He will likely die behind bars. But Kathryn Hinnant died at 33. Her life and career cut short by a violent predator who turned a place of healing into a hunting ground. The Bellevue Intruder is a reminder that the sprawling chaos of a major city hospital, the very thing that makes it capable of serving so many people, also makes it vulnerable to exploitation. That the symbols of authority we trust, the white lab coat, the ID badge, the professional demeanor, can be stolen and weaponized. And it's a reminder that the people who work late, who stay behind after the crowds have gone, who dedicate extra hours to their research and their patients, are often the most vulnerable. They work alone, in quiet spaces, trusting that the institution will protect them. But on the night of January 7, 1989, Bellevue Hospital didn't protect Dr. Kathryn Hinnant, and she paid for that failure with her life. The Hero Syndrome. The crimes of Richard Angelo, the Angel of Death. Good Samaritan Hospital, Long Island, New York, 1987. There's a particular kind of narcissism that drives some people into professions where they can be seen as heroes. They don't just want to help people, they want to be recognized for helping people. They crave the admiration, the gratitude, the moment when someone looks at them and says, "You saved my life." For most people in emergency services and healthcare, that recognition is a byproduct of the work, not the motivation. They do the job because it needs to be done, because people need help, because it's the right thing to do. But for a small subset of individuals, the recognition becomes the primary goal, and they'll do anything to achieve it, even if it means creating the emergencies they want to be praised for solving. Richard Angelo was one of those people. And in 1987, working as a nurse at Good Samaritan Hospital on Long Island, he devised a sick, twisted system for manufacturing his own heroism. He would inject patients with drugs that induced respiratory arrest, wait for the code blue alarm to sound, and then rush in to save them in front of his colleagues. He wanted to be the hero. He wanted the glory of the resuscitation. He wanted people to look at him with awe and gratitude. But he didn't save everyone. And the patients who died in his quest for recognition became victims of one of the most disturbing cases of medical murder in American history. Richard Angelo was born in 1962 and grew up on Long Island. By all accounts, he was an unremarkable student. Average grades, few close friends, a quiet kid who didn't stand out in any particular way. But he was drawn to emergency services, to the drama and intensity of life and death situations. He became an emergency medical technician, EMT, working for a local ambulance service. He was competent at the job, but colleagues noticed something odd about him. He seemed to crave the dramatic calls, the critical patients, the moments when adrenaline was high and the outcome uncertain. He was less interested in the routine transports and more interested in the cases where he could be seen as making a difference. In the mid-1980s, Angelo went to nursing school and earned his RN license. He was hired at Good Samaritan Hospital in West Islip, New York, a well-regarded community hospital that served Long Island's South Shore. Angelo was assigned to the intensive care unit and the medical surgical floors, working primarily the night shift. On paper, he was a good nurse. He showed up on time. He was attentive to his patients. He followed protocols. But almost immediately, colleagues began to notice something strange. When Richard Angelo was on shift, codes were called more often. Patients who had been stable would suddenly crash. Respiratory arrest, cardiac arrest, sudden unexplained deterioration. And Angelo was always there, rushing in, performing CPR, assisting with intubation, working the crash cart. Some of the patients survived, and Angelo would bask in the gratitude of their families, the praise of his colleagues, the recognition that he had been part of saving a life. But some of the patients didn't survive, and those deaths, initially, were attributed to the natural progression of their illnesses. After all, people in the ICU are sick. Codes happen. Not every resuscitation is successful, except the frequency of codes on Angelo's shifts was statistically abnormal. And some of the patients who crashed shouldn't have. They were stable, recovering, expected to be discharged within days. The pattern continued for months. Patients would be doing well, and then suddenly, they would stop breathing. The alarms would sound. The crash team would rush in, and Richard Angelo would be there, ready to help, ready to be the hero. But in October 1987, the pattern was broken by a patient who survived and who could talk. Girolamo Kucic was a 73-year-old man being treated at Good Samaritan for a relatively minor condition. He was stable, alert, and expected to go home soon. On the night of October 11th, Richard Angelo was his nurse. Kucic later described what happened. Angelo came into his room and told him he was going to give him an injection, a routine medication, he said. Kucic didn't think anything of it. He trusted his nurse. But almost immediately after the injection, Kucic began to feel strange. His muscles became weak. He had difficulty breathing. He felt paralyzed, unable to move, unable to call for help. And then he saw Angelo standing at the doorway, watching him, waiting. Kucic thought he was going to die. His breathing became more and more labored. And then, just as he was on the verge of losing consciousness, Angelo suddenly sprang into action. He called a code. The crash team rushed in. Kucic was intubated, put on a ventilator, stabilized, and Richard Angelo was there, helping, performing his role as the dutiful nurse, the hero who had responded to the emergency. But Girolamo Kucic didn't forget what he had seen. When he recovered enough to speak, when the breathing tube was removed and he could communicate, he told the medical staff what had happened. "That nurse," he said, "the one with the beard, he gave me a shot." The hospital administration was alerted immediately. They reviewed Kucic's medical records, the medications that had been ordered, the timeline of events, and they found a discrepancy. The injection Angelo had given Kucic hadn't been ordered by a doctor. There was no record of it in the chart. Angelo had injected Kucic with something that wasn't prescribed, something that had caused respiratory arrest, and he had done it deliberately. Hospital security and the Suffolk County Police Department launched an investigation. They interviewed Richard Angelo, and initially, he denied everything. He claimed Kucic was confused, that the medications had caused hallucinations, that the patient's memory of events was unreliable. But investigators weren't convinced. They began looking at other patients who had coded on Angelo's shifts. They reviewed medical records, medication logs, and patient outcomes. And they found a disturbing pattern. Multiple patients had experienced sudden, unexplained respiratory arrests while under Angelo's care. Some had survived. Some had died. And in several cases, there were irregularities in the medication records. Drugs that had been accessed but not documented. Syringes that had been used but not accounted for. Investigators obtained a warrant to search Angelo's locker at the hospital. And what they found was damning. Vials of Pavilon and Anectine, powerful paralytic drugs used during surgery and intubation. These drugs, when administered to a conscious, breathing patient, cause complete paralysis of the muscles, including the diaphragm. The patient becomes unable to breathe, but remains conscious and aware. A terrifying experience of suffocation while fully alert. These drugs had no legitimate reason to be in Angelo's locker. They weren't medications he would use in routine nursing care. They were controlled substances, and their presence suggested he'd been stealing them from the hospital pharmacy and using them on patients. Confronted with the evidence, Richard Angelo eventually confessed. And what he described was a calculated, methodical system of creating emergencies so he could be the hero who responded to them. Angelo would select a patient, usually someone who was stable, not critically ill, someone whose sudden deterioration would be surprising. He would enter their room during the night shift, when supervision was minimal and other staff were busy. He would inject them with Pavilon or Anectine, drugs that would cause respiratory paralysis. Then, he would wait. He would watch as the patient stopped breathing, as their oxygen levels dropped, as the monitors began to alarm. And then, at the last possible moment, he would call a code. The crash team would arrive. Angelo would be there, helping with CPR, assisting with intubation, playing the role of the competent, dedicated nurse. And if the patient survived, Angelo would receive praise, gratitude, recognition. He called it his magic injection. He believed he had the power to decide who lived and who died, to control the situation, to be the hero of his own manufactured drama. But the problem was, not every patient survived. Some died despite the resuscitation efforts. Some suffered brain damage from oxygen deprivation. Some were left with permanent disabilities. And Angelo didn't seem to care. The deaths to him were acceptable losses in his quest for recognition and admiration. Investigators identified at least 25 patients who had been injected by Angelo. Of those, at least 4 died. The true number may be higher, but many of Angelo's victims had been cremated or buried, making it impossible to perform toxicology tests that would have detected the presence of the paralytic drugs. Richard Angelo was arrested in November 1987 and charged with multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, assault, and reckless endangerment. His trial began in 1989 and became a media sensation. The idea that a nurse, someone entrusted with the care of vulnerable patients, had been deliberately inducing medical emergencies for personal gratification was shocking and horrifying. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. The vials of Pavulan and Anictine found in Angelo's locker, the testimony of Girolamo Kucic, the medical records showing the pattern of unexplained respiratory arrests, and Angelo's own confession. The defense tried to argue that Angelo had mental health issues, that he was suffering from a psychological disorder that compelled him to seek recognition and validation. They portrayed him as a troubled individual who needed treatment, not punishment. But the jury wasn't swayed. The evidence showed that Angelo had acted with premeditation, that he had stolen drugs, that he had deliberately injected patients, and that he had done so repeatedly over a period of months. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment or a mental health crisis. This was a calculated pattern of behavior. Richard Angelo was convicted on multiple counts of second-degree murder and assault. He was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. At his sentencing, Angelo showed little emotion. He offered no real apology, no expression of remorse that seemed genuine. He spoke briefly, claiming that he had never intended to hurt anyone, that he had only wanted to help, to be good at his job. But the families of his victims saw through the words. They knew that their loved ones had been used as props in Angelo's twisted quest for recognition, that their suffering and death had been tools for his ego. One family member speaking at the sentencing said, "You wanted to be a hero, but heroes don't create the disasters they claim to solve. Heroes don't kill people for applause." The psychological profile of Richard Angelo is a case study in what's known as hero syndrome or Munchausen syndrome, by proxy in a medical context. Individuals with this syndrome create emergencies or illnesses so they can be seen as the rescuer, the caregiver, the hero. They crave the attention, the praise, the sense of importance that comes from being needed in a crisis. In Angelo's case, the syndrome manifested in the most extreme way possible. He was literally killing patients to create opportunities to be praised for trying to save them. Psychologists who have studied the case note that Angelo's need for recognition was pathological. He had low self-esteem, felt inadequate in his personal life, and sought validation through his professional role. But simply being a competent nurse wasn't enough. He needed to be seen as exceptional, as heroic, as someone who made a difference in life and death situations. So he manufactured those situations. And he did so with a chilling lack of empathy for the people he was using. You might wonder how Angelo was able to operate for as long as he did without being caught. The answer, as with many medical serial killers, lies in the environment of the hospital and the assumptions people make. First, hospitals are places where people die. Unexpected deaths, while tragic, are not automatically suspicious, especially in intensive care units, where patients are critically ill. Codes and deaths are part of the reality of medicine. Second, nurses are trusted. They're seen as caregivers, as helpers, as people who have dedicated their lives to healing. The idea that a nurse would deliberately harm a patient is so contrary to expectations that it's difficult for people to accept, even when evidence is staring them in the face. Third, the night shift provides cover. Staffing is thinner. Supervision is reduced. And the autonomy that nurses have during overnight hours means that someone like Angelo can act without immediate oversight. Angelo exploited all of these factors. He used the trust placed in him, the chaos of the night shift, and the normalcy of codes in a hospital setting to commit his crimes. It wasn't until the patient survived and could articulate what had happened that the pattern was broken. Gerolamo Kuci's testimony was the key that unlocked the investigation. Without his survival and his willingness to speak up, Angelo might have continued for much longer. Richard Angelo is now in his 60s, serving his sentence at Clinton Correctional Facility in upstate New York. He has been denied parole multiple times and will likely spend the rest of his life in prison. The patients he murdered, Nancy Savino, Frederick Lagua, John Fisher, and Anthony Green, were victims of his ego. They were recovering. They were going to go home. They were going to live. But Richard Angelo decided to use them as tools for his own gratification, and they died because of it. The patients who survived, like Gerolamo Kucic, carry the trauma of what happened to them. They remember the sensation of being paralyzed, of being unable to breathe, of believing they were about to die. And they remember seeing Angelo's face, watching them, waiting. Good Samaritan Hospital implemented sweeping changes after Angelo's arrest. Medication access was tightened. Controlled substances were monitored more closely. Statistical analysis of patient outcomes became standard practice, looking for patterns of unusual events that might indicate a problem. But these changes came too late for Angelo's victims. The hero syndrome is one of the most disturbing motives for medical murder because it reveals a fundamental inversion of values. Richard Angelo entered healthcare because he wanted recognition, not because he wanted to help people. And when helping people didn't bring him the admiration he craved, he decided to create emergencies, to hurt people, so he could be seen as heroic. The white coat, the stethoscope, the nurse's badge, these are symbols of trust, of healing, of care. But Richard Angelo wore those symbols while committing murder, and in doing so, he betrayed every patient who trusted him, every colleague who worked alongside him, and every family who believed their loved one was safe in his care. The angel of death wasn't bringing mercy. He was bringing terror, wrapped in the illusion of heroism. The Magic Syringe. The Crimes of Efren Saldivar. Glendale Adventist Medical Center, California. 1989-1998. There are people who believe they have the right to decide who lives and who dies. Not because they're doctors making medical decisions. Not because they're acting in the patient's best interest. But because they've appointed themselves as arbiters of life. Judges who can look at a person in a hospital bed and decide, this one stays, this one goes. Efren Saldivar was one of those people. And for nearly a decade, working the graveyard shift as a respiratory therapist at Glendale Adventist Medical Center in California. He played God with the lives of elderly patients, injecting them with paralytic drugs and watching them stop breathing. He called his stash of drugs his magic syringe. He bragged to coworkers about how easy it was to kill patients without being caught. And he viewed himself not as a murderer, but as an angel of mercy. Someone who was ending the suffering of people who were old, sick, and in his twisted view, better off dead. The problem with Saldivar's mercy was that the patients didn't ask for it. Their families didn't consent to it. And many of the people he killed weren't dying. They were recovering, they were stable, they were going to go home. But Efren Saldivar decided they shouldn't. And for almost a decade, he got away with it. Efren Saldivar was born in 1969 in Cuba and immigrated to the United States as a child. He grew up in Southern California and, in his early 20s, trained to become a respiratory therapist, a healthcare professional who specializes in treating patients with breathing and cardiopulmonary disorders. Respiratory therapists manage ventilators, administer breathing treatments, monitor oxygen levels, and assist with intubation. It's a critical role in hospitals, especially in intensive care units and respiratory wards where patients are struggling to breathe. In 1989, Saldivar was hired at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, a well-regarded hospital in the Los Angeles area. He was assigned to the respiratory care department, working primarily the night shift in the respiratory ward and the ICU. He was good at his job, by most accounts. He was knowledgeable, efficient, and seemed to care about his patients. But colleagues began to notice something odd about Saldivar. He made dark jokes about death. He talked about how easy it would be to kill patients. He bragged about having access to drugs that could stop breathing without leaving a trace. Most people assumed he was joking. Dark humor is common in healthcare. It's a coping mechanism for people who work in environments where death is a constant presence. But Saldivar wasn't joking. He was describing what he was actually doing. Over the course of nearly a decade, Saldivar killed patients on his shifts. His method was consistent. He would enter the room of an elderly patient, someone who was on oxygen or a ventilator, someone whose death wouldn't be entirely unexpected. He would inject them with Pavulan, or succinylcholine, paralytic drugs that cause complete muscle paralysis, including the diaphragm. The patient would stop breathing. If they were on a ventilator, Saldivar would disconnect it or adjust the settings so the alarm wouldn't sound immediately. If they were breathing on their own, he would simply wait as they suffocated, unable to move, unable to call for help, dying slowly as their oxygen levels dropped. And then, when the patient was dead, Saldivar would document it as a natural death. The patient was old. They were sick. They had underlying conditions. Death, in a hospital setting, especially in a respiratory ward, is not uncommon. Saldivar believed he was performing a service. He told coworkers that he was helping patients who were suffering, who had no quality of life, who were better off dead. He saw himself as compassionate, as merciful, as someone who had the courage to do what others wouldn't. But the reality was that Saldivar was a serial killer. He was selecting victims based on his own judgment, his own twisted sense of morality. And he was murdering them without their consent, without their family's knowledge, without any legal or ethical authority. And he got away with it for years because the victims were elderly, because they had existing health problems, and because their deaths looked natural. But in 1998, the truth began to emerge, not because investigators uncovered a pattern, but because Saldivar himself couldn't keep quiet. He bragged. He told coworkers about what he had done. He described his methods, his magic syringe, the patients he had killed. Some coworkers thought he was exaggerating, engaging in dark humor, but others were disturbed. And eventually, someone reported him. In March 1998, hospital administrators received an anonymous tip that Efren Saldivar had been killing patients. The tip was detailed enough that the hospital couldn't ignore it. They contacted the Glendale Police Department, and an investigation was launched. Detectives interviewed Saldivar Darta, and in a stunning development, he confessed. He admitted to killing patients. He described his methods. He said he had killed between 40 and 50 people over the course of his career at Glendale Adventist. But then, after giving his initial confession, Saldivar recanted. He claimed he had made it up, that he had been exaggerating, that he was just trying to impress people with dark stories. He said he hadn't actually killed anyone. And prosecutors faced a problem. Without physical evidence, without bodies to exhume and test for drugs, they couldn't prove the murders had occurred. Saldivar's confession, now recanted, wasn't enough on its own. The case stalled. Saldivar was fired from the hospital, but he wasn't arrested. The investigation continued, but it seemed to be going nowhere. For 4 years, the case remained in limbo. Prosecutors knew that Saldivar had likely killed patients, but they couldn't prove it. They needed physical evidence. They needed bodies. So investigators made a controversial decision. They would exhume the bodies of patients who had died on Saldivar shifts and test them for the presence of paralytic drugs. It was a massive undertaking. Dozens of bodies were exhumed. Tissue samples were taken. Toxicology tests were performed. And the results were chilling. Multiple bodies tested positive for Pavulan, or succinylcholine, drugs that had no medical reason to be in their systems, drugs that would have caused paralysis and death. The physical evidence confirmed what investigators had suspected. Efren Saldivar was a serial killer. In 2002, Saldivar was arrested and charged with 6 counts of murder. Faced with forensic evidence, he decided to plead guilty. In exchange for a plea deal that spared him the death penalty, Saldivar admitted to killing patients and agreed to provide details about his crimes. He confessed to killing at least 50 patients, though the exact number may be higher. He described how he selected victims, usually elderly patients with chronic illnesses, people he deemed to have poor quality of life. He described how he injected them, how he watched them die, how he documented their deaths as natural, and he described his mindset. He saw himself as an angel of mercy, as someone who was ending suffering. He believed he was doing the right thing, but the families of his victims saw it differently. Their loved ones had been murdered. People who were recovering, who were expected to go home, who were looking forward to seeing their families again. Those people were killed by a respiratory therapist who had decided on his own that they didn't deserve to live. Efren Saldivar was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sent to California State Prison, where he remains to this day. At his sentencing, families of the victims spoke about the devastation his crimes had caused. They talked about the trust they had placed in the hospital, in the medical professionals caring for their loved ones. They talked about the phone calls they had received, telling them their mother or father or spouse had died peacefully in the night. They talked about believing for years that those deaths were natural, only to learn, much later, that their loved ones had been murdered. The psychological impact on the families was profound. They had grieved, mourned, moved on, only to have the wound reopened years later when they learned the truth. Some families described it as a double grief. First, the loss of their loved one, and then the betrayal of learning how they really died. The respiratory therapist role was key to Saldivar's crimes. Respiratory therapists have access to paralytic drugs, to ventilators, to the equipment that keeps critically ill patients alive. They work independently, often without direct supervision, and they're trusted implicitly. Patients and families assume that the person managing the ventilator, the person adjusting the oxygen, is working to keep the patient alive. But Saldivar used that trust, that access, that autonomy to commit murder. You might wonder how Saldivar could kill 50 patients without anyone noticing. The answer lies in the nature of his victims and the environment of the respiratory ward. First, Saldivar targeted elderly patients with chronic illnesses. These were people who were expected to die eventually. When they did die, it wasn't surprising. It was sad, but it was seen as the natural progression of their illness. Second, the drugs Saldivar used, Pavilon and succinylcholine, are metabolized relatively quickly by the body. Unless toxicology tests are performed shortly after death, the drugs can be difficult to detect. And in 1998, routine toxicology testing for these specific drugs wasn't standard practice for elderly patients who died in hospitals. Third, the night shift provided cover. Saldivar worked when staffing was minimal, when supervision was reduced, when other healthcare workers were busy with their own patients. He could enter a room, inject a patient, and leave without anyone questioning what he was doing. And fourth, Saldivar's angel of mercy narrative allowed him to rationalize his actions. He convinced himself that he was helping patients, that he was ending suffering. This self-deception allowed him to continue killing without the psychological burden of seeing himself as a murderer. But the families of his victims reject that narrative. They point out that many of the people Saldivar killed weren't suffering. They were recovering. They were stable. They were going to go home. The decision to end their lives wasn't mercy, it was murder. Efren Saldivar's case led to significant changes in how hospitals monitor respiratory therapists and other healthcare workers with access to dangerous drugs. Medication dispensing systems were upgraded to track every access, every withdrawal. Surveillance was increased, and statistical analysis of patient outcomes became more sophisticated, looking for patterns that might indicate a problem. But these changes came too late for the 50 patients Saldivar killed. Glendale Adventist Medical Center faced lawsuits from the families of victims. Some families settled. Others went to trial. But no amount of money could bring back their loved ones or erase the betrayal they felt. The magic syringe wasn't magic at all. It was a weapon. And Efren Saldivar used it to kill people who trusted him, who believed he was there to help them breathe, who never imagined that the respiratory therapist adjusting their oxygen was deciding whether they would live or die. The graveyard shift in the respiratory ward was supposed to be a place of care, a place where patients struggling to breathe could rest, knowing that trained professionals were monitoring them. But for nearly a decade, the person monitoring them was Efren Saldivar, and for at least 50 patients, the night shift was their last. Saldivar is now in his 50s, serving a life sentence with no possibility of parole. He will die in prison. But the patients he killed, elderly men and women who had lived full lives, who had families who loved them, who deserved to die naturally, surrounded by people who cared for them, they died alone, in the dark, at the hands of a man who decided he had the right to play God. The magic syringe claimed 50 lives, and the families of those victims are still asking the same question. How could this happen? How could a hospital employ a serial killer for nearly a decade without noticing? The answer is the same as it has been in every story we've told tonight. Because the system trusted him. Because the environment allowed it. And because when someone wears a uniform and carries a stethoscope, we assume they're there to help. But sometimes, the person in the white coat is the most dangerous person in the room. The VA Hospital Terror. The Crimes of Kristen Gilbert. Leeds, Massachusetts, Veterans Affairs Medical Center, 1995-1996. There are motives for murder that most people can at least understand, even if they don't condone them. Greed, revenge, self-defense, fear. These are terrible reasons to take a life, but they're comprehensible. The human mind can trace the logic, however twisted, from motive to action. But then there are motives so petty, so narcissistic, so incomprehensibly trivial that they defy understanding. Motives that reveal a level of self-absorption so profound that other human beings become nothing more than props in a personal drama. Kristen Gilbert had one of those motives. She was a nurse at a Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Leeds, Massachusetts. She was having an affair with a hospital security guard named James Perot, and she realized that when she called a medical emergency, when she initiated a code blue for a patient in cardiac arrest, James would come running to the ward to respond. So Kristen Gilbert began inducing cardiac arrests in elderly veterans. She would inject them with epinephrine, a powerful cardiac stimulant that, in excessive doses, causes fatal arrhythmias and heart attacks. And she would do this for one reason, and one reason only, to create opportunities to flirt with her lover during the chaos of the emergency response. She was killing people to get attention from a man. She was using the bodies of veterans, men who had served their country, who had survived wars and hardships, as props in her romantic fantasy. And she nearly got away with it. Kristen Gilbert was born Kristen Strickland in 1967 in Fall River, Massachusetts, Derbyshire. She grew up in a middle-class family, did reasonably well in school, and pursued nursing as a career. In 1988, she married Glenn Gilbert, and the couple had 2 children. From the outside, she appeared to be living a normal, stable life. A working mother, a dedicated nurse, a member of the community. But beneath the surface, Kristen Gilbert craved attention, drama, and excitement. Her marriage became stale. Her routine became boring. And she began looking for ways to inject intensity and passion into her life. In 1990, Gilbert was hired as a nurse at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts. The facility served the Leeds area. The VA hospital was a large complex that provided medical care to veterans, many of whom were elderly men with chronic health conditions, heart disease, diabetes, lung problems, the accumulated toll of decades of life, and, in many cases, military service. Gilbert was assigned to Ward C, a medical surgical unit where patients with serious but non-critical conditions were treated. It was demanding work, but relatively routine, monitoring patients, administering medications, responding to emergencies when they arose. But for Kristen Gilbert, routine wasn't enough. She wanted drama. She wanted to be at the center of life and death situations. She wanted to feel important, indispensable, heroic, and she found a way to manufacture all of that. In the mid-1990s, Gilbert began an affair with James Perot, a security guard at the VA hospital. Perot was married, as was Gilbert, but that didn't stop them from conducting a relationship that was equal parts romance and obsession. Gilbert became infatuated with Perot, and she found that the time she felt closest to him were during medical emergencies. When Code Blue was called, when a patient went into cardiac arrest and the emergency response team was summoned, Perot, as part of hospital security, would respond to the ward. He would help manage the scene, control access, assist the medical team. And during those chaotic adrenaline-fueled moments, Gilbert and Perot would interact. They would exchange glances, brief words, the kind of charged connection that comes from shared intensity. Gilbert realized that she could create those moments. She could induce the emergencies. She could manufacture the drama that brought Perot to her ward. And she could use the patients, the vulnerable, elderly veterans in her care, as the means to that end. So she began killing them. Her method was insidious in its simplicity. Gilbert had access to the medication dispensary on Ward C. Among the drugs available was epinephrine, a hormone and medication used in emergency situations to stimulate the heart and increase blood pressure. In controlled doses, epinephrine saves lives. It's used during cardiac arrest, severe allergic reactions, and other critical situations. But in excessive doses, epinephrine is lethal. It causes the heart to beat too fast, too hard, too irregularly. It induces fatal arrhythmias, ventricular fibrillation, ventricular tachycardia that result in cardiac arrest. Gilbert would access the medication dispensary, obtain vials of epinephrine, and then inject it into her patients' IV lines. The patients, most of whom were elderly with existing heart conditions, would quickly go into cardiac arrest. The monitors would alarm. The code blue would be called, and James Perot would come running. Gilbert would be at the center of the emergency, working the code, performing CPR, assisting with defibrillation. And when it was over, whether the patient survived or died, she would have her moment with Perot, the shared adrenaline, the connection forged in crisis. But some of Gilbert's colleagues began to notice a pattern. When Kristen Gilbert was on shift, codes were called with alarming frequency. Ward C, which typically experienced a handful of cardiac arrests per month, was suddenly seeing multiple codes per shift when Gilbert was working. The statistical anomaly was striking. On shifts when Gilbert wasn't working, Ward C had a normal rate of cardiac events. But on shifts when she was present, the rate spiked dramatically, often 3 or 4 times higher than the hospital average. Nurses whispered among themselves. Some nicknamed Gilbert the Angel of Death. Some refused to work shifts with her, claiming that patients always seemed to die when she was around. But for a long time, no one reported their suspicions to hospital administration. Healthcare workers are reluctant to accuse a colleague of murder without proof, and the idea that a nurse, a fellow caregiver, would deliberately kill patients was almost too horrible to contemplate. But in 1996, the whispers became too loud to ignore. A group of nurses on Ward C went to hospital administration and expressed their concerns about the unusually high number of deaths and cardiac arrests on Gilbert's shifts. They didn't explicitly accuse her of murder, but they presented the statistical data and asked for an investigation. The VA hospital administration took the complaint seriously. They contacted the VA Office of Inspector General, and an investigation was launched. Investigators began reviewing medical records, medication logs, and patient outcomes. They compared mortality rates on Gilbert's shifts to mortality rates on other shifts, and the pattern was undeniable. But proving that Gilbert had murdered patients required more than statistics. It required forensic evidence. So investigators focused on the medication dispensary. They reviewed access logs to see who had been withdrawing epinephrine and when. And they found that Gilbert had been accessing the drug far more frequently than her duties required, and often at times that corresponded with cardiac arrests. As the investigation closed in on her, Kristen Gilbert's behavior became increasingly erratic. She began making threatening phone calls to the hospital, claiming there was a bomb in the building. The calls were traced back to her, and she was arrested on bomb threat charges in September 1996. While she was in custody on those charges, investigators continued building the murder case. They exhumed the bodies of several patients who had died on Gilbert's shifts and performed toxicology tests. The tests revealed elevated levels of epinephrine in the tissues, levels far higher than would occur naturally or as a result of legitimate medical treatment. The forensic evidence confirmed what the statistics had suggested. Kristen Gilbert had been injecting patients with lethal doses of epinephrine, inducing cardiac arrests and causing deaths. In 1998, Gilbert was indicted on multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. The indictment alleged that she had killed at least 4 patients: Kenneth Cutting, Henry Hudowski, and Edward Squira, and had attempted to kill several others. All of the victims were elderly veterans, men who had served their country in World War II or the Korean War, men who deserved to spend their final years in peace and dignity. Instead, they became pawns in Kristen Gilbert's twisted romantic game. The trial of Kristen Gilbert began in 2000 and became one of the most closely watched medical murder cases of the decade. The prosecution presented a devastating case built on three pillars: statistical evidence, forensic evidence, and witness testimony. The statistical evidence showed that the mortality rate on Ward C increased by 350% when Gilbert was on duty. On shifts when she wasn't working, the cardiac arrest rate was normal. But on her shifts, it spiked dramatically. The correlation was too strong to be coincidental. The forensic evidence showed elevated levels of epinephrine in the exhumed bodies of Gilbert's victims, levels that could only have been caused by deliberate injection, not by natural causes or legitimate medical treatment. And the witness testimony, from nurses who had worked with Gilbert, from James Perot himself, and from medical experts, painted a picture of a woman obsessed with drama, attention, and her illicit relationship. Perot testified that Gilbert had become increasingly fixated on him, that she had divorced her husband to pursue the relationship, and that she had told him she wanted to work shifts when emergencies were likely to occur. The defense tried to argue that the deaths were natural, that the statistical evidence was misleading, that Gilbert was being scapegoated for systemic problems at the VA hospital. But the evidence was overwhelming. In March 2001, the jury found Kristen Gilbert guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and 2 counts of attempted murder. The jury deadlocked on whether to impose the death penalty, and the judge sentenced Gilbert to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. At her sentencing, families of the victims spoke about the men Gilbert had killed. Kenneth Cutting was a 41-year-old Army veteran who had been hospitalized for a relatively minor condition. He was expected to recover and go home. Instead, Gilbert injected him with epinephrine, and he died of cardiac arrest. Henry Hudon was a 35-year-old Air Force veteran with a young family. He was being treated for a manageable illness. Gilbert killed him to create another opportunity to see James Perot. Stanley Jagodowski was a 66-year-old World War II veteran who had survived the horrors of war, only to be murdered by a nurse in a VA hospital decades later. Edward Squira was a 69-year-old veteran who was recovering from surgery. He was stable, improving, looking forward to going home. Gilbert injected him, and he died. These men had served their country. They had survived battles, hardships, and decades of life. And they were killed by a nurse who saw them not as human beings, not as people with families and histories and dignity, but as props, tools she could use to manufacture drama and capture the attention of her lover. The families spoke about the betrayal they felt. They had trusted the VA hospital to care for their loved ones. They had trusted the nurses, the doctors, the staff. And one of those nurses had been a serial killer, using their family members' bodies to orchestrate moments of intimacy with a security guard. You might wonder how Kristen Gilbert could be so callous, so narcissistic, so utterly devoid of empathy, that she would kill people for such a trivial reason. Psychologists who have studied her case describe her as having a severe personality disorder characterized by narcissism, a need for attention, and an inability to see other people as anything more than supporting characters in her own drama. For Gilbert, the veterans on Ward C weren't real people. They were extras in the movie of her life, expendable props that could be sacrificed to create the scene she wanted to play out with James Perot. This level of self-absorption is almost incomprehensible to most people. But it's a defining characteristic of certain serial killers, particularly those who operate in healthcare settings. They see themselves as the center of the universe, and they view their victims not as individuals with lives, families, and intrinsic worth, but as objects to be manipulated for personal gain. Gilbert wanted excitement. She wanted passion. She wanted to feel alive, important, needed, and she was willing to kill to get those feelings. The veterans she murdered had no idea they were being used. They trusted her. When she entered their rooms to check their vitals, to adjust their medications, to provide care, they believed she was there to help them. They never imagined that the nurse with the syringe was injecting them with a lethal dose of epinephrine, so she could flirt with a security guard during the ensuing emergency. Kristen Gilbert is now serving her life sentences at the Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, a federal prison that houses female inmates with medical and mental health needs. She is in her 50s, and she will never be released. She will die in prison. James Parole, the security guard who was the object of Gilbert's obsession, testified against her at trial. He described how Gilbert had become increasingly unstable, how she had made threats, how she had confessed to him, obliquely, in ways he didn't fully understand at the time, that she had been causing the cardiac arrests on Ward C. Parole's testimony was critical to the prosecution's case, but he also had to live with the knowledge that his affair with Gilbert had, in some sense, fueled her murders. She had killed to get his attention, to create moments with him, to feel connected to him during the adrenaline rush of a code. He has spoken publicly about the guilt he feels, the realization that the patients might still be alive if the affair had never happened. That guilt, however irrational, Gilbert alone is responsible for her crimes, has haunted him. The VA hospital terror is a case study in how the most mundane human emotions, vanity, lust, the desire for attention, can metastasize into monstrous behavior when combined with access, opportunity, and a complete lack of empathy. Kristen Gilbert didn't kill for money. She didn't kill for revenge. She didn't kill because she was mentally ill in the traditional sense. She knew what she was doing. She knew it was wrong, and she did it anyway. She killed because she wanted a man to notice her. She killed because she craved drama. She killed because the lives of elderly veterans meant less to her than the thrill of flirting with a security guard during a medical emergency. The Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Leeds, Massachusetts, implemented sweeping changes after Gilbert's arrest. Medication access was tightened. Statistical analysis of patient outcomes became standard practice. Surveillance was increased, and staff were trained to report suspicious patterns, even if it meant accusing a colleague. But these changes came too late for Kenneth Cutting, Henry Houdin, Stanley Jakodowski, and Edward Squira. They came too late for the families who lost their fathers, husbands, brothers. The VA hospital is still in operation, still serving veterans, still providing the medical care that men and women who served their country deserve. But the memory of Kristen Gilbert, the nurse who turned a place of healing into a hunting ground, remains a scar on the institution's history. The veterans she killed had survived wars. They had faced enemy fire, disease, injury, and the countless dangers of military service. They had come home, built lives, raised families, and they ended up in a VA hospital, trusting that they were safe, that the nurses caring for them were dedicated professionals. But one of those nurses was Kristen Gilbert, and she saw them not as heroes, not as human beings, but as tools, instruments she could use to create the romantic drama she craved. The VA hospital terror claimed at least 4 lives. And the question that haunts everyone who studies this case is, how could someone be so vain, so narcissistic, so utterly devoid of humanity that they would kill people to get attention from a lover? The answer is that some people are capable of anything when they see others as less than human. When empathy is absent, when narcissism rules, when self-interest is the only value that matters, then murder becomes just another tool in the pursuit of personal gratification. Kristen Gilbert used epinephrine the way most people use a phone call or a text message, as a way to get someone's attention. Except her method killed people, and she didn't care. The veterans she murdered deserved better. They deserved to die naturally, surrounded by family, honored for their service. Instead, they died because a nurse wanted to flirt with a security guard. And that, perhaps, is the most chilling thing about Kristen Gilbert's crimes, the sheer banality of her motive. She didn't kill for grand reasons or twisted ideologies. She killed for the most petty, trivial, selfish reason imaginable. She killed for attention. The Orderly of Death. The Crimes of Donald Harvey. Cincinnati, Ohio, Kentucky. 1970s, 1980s. There's a hierarchy in hospitals. At the top are the doctors, the specialists, the surgeons, the attending physicians who make the critical decisions and perform the life-saving procedures. Below them are the nurses, the physician assistants, the technicians. And at the bottom of the hierarchy are the orderlies, the people who clean the rooms, change the sheets, empty the bedpans, move the patients, do the unglamorous, invisible work that keeps a hospital function. Orderlies are background figures. Patients barely notice them. Doctors don't consult them. They're the people who mop the floors and take out the trash while the important work of medicine happens around them. But Donald Harvey, who worked as an orderly at hospitals in Cincinnati, Ohio, and northern Kentucky for nearly 2 decades, held more power than anyone realized. He had access to patients. He had access to their food, their water, their medications. He moved through hospital rooms like a ghost, performing tasks that were beneath the notice of doctors and nurses. And he killed. By his own confession, he killed 87 people, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. And he did it using a terrifying variety of methods: cyanide, arsenic, rat poison, petroleum distillates, suffocation, disconnecting ventilators, and even injecting patients with HIV and hepatitis viruses. He killed patients he didn't like, patients who were messy, patients he felt sorry for, patients who annoyed him, and patients whose deaths, he believed, were acts of mercy. Donald Harvey was the ultimate night watch predator, an invisible worker who held the power of life and death, who moved through hospitals for decades, killing with impunity while doctors and nurses remained oblivious. And he nearly got away with all of it. Donald Harvey was born in 1952 in Boonville, Kentucky, and grew up in a troubled, abusive household. He was sexually abused as a child, suffered from depression and anger, and developed a fascination with death at an early age. By his own later accounts, he killed his first victim, a hospital patient, when he was just 18 years old, working as an orderly at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. Harvey described the killing as an act of mercy. The patient was elderly, suffering, and Harvey believed he was helping by ending the patient's life. He suffocated the man with a pillow, and no one suspected foul play. The patient was old, sick, and death was expected. This first killing, Harvey would later say, was a revelation. He realized how easy it was, how much power he had, how simple it was to take a life without anyone noticing. And he kept killing. Over the next 2 decades, Harvey worked at multiple hospitals in the Cincinnati and northern Kentucky area. Marymount Hospital, the VA Medical Center in Cincinnati, Drake Memorial Hospital, and Daniel Drake Memorial Hospital. At each facility, he worked as an orderly or nurse's aide, low-level positions that involved patient care, cleaning, and maintenance. And at each facility, patients began dying under suspicious circumstances. But because the victims were elderly, sick, or terminally ill, and because Harvey's methods were varied and often difficult to detect, the deaths were attributed to natural causes. Harvey's methods were astonishingly diverse. He didn't rely on a single technique or a single poison. He adapted to whatever was available, whatever would be least likely to be detected. He used cyanide, which he obtained from various sources and mixed into patients' food or injected into their IV lines. Cyanide causes rapid cell death by preventing cells from using oxygen. Victims experience dizziness, confusion, seizures, and cardiac arrest. And because cyanide is metabolized quickly, it can be difficult to detect in autopsy unless toxicologists are specifically looking for it. He used arsenic, a classic poison that causes gastrointestinal distress, organ failure, and death. Arsenic can be administered in small doses over time, causing a slow, agonizing death that mimics natural illness, or in large doses for a quicker kill. He used rat poison, which contains anticoagulants that cause internal bleeding. Victims bleed to death from the inside, and if they're already hospitalized for other conditions, the bleeding can be attributed to complications of their illness or treatment. He used petroleum distillates, cleaning fluids and solvents, which he would pour into patients' IV bags or feeding tubes. These chemicals cause severe damage to internal organs and can be rapidly fatal. He would disconnect ventilators, cutting off oxygen to patients who were dependent on mechanical breathing. The patients would suffocate, and the deaths would often be attributed to respiratory failure, a natural outcome for someone already in critical condition. He would inject patients with hepatitis B and HIV viruses, causing infections that would kill them months or years later, long after Harvey had moved on to another facility. And in some cases, he simply suffocated patients with pillows or plastic bags, using the most direct method possible. But why? Why did Donald Harvey kill so many people, using so many different methods, over so many years? Harvey himself has given multiple contradictory explanations. At times, he claimed he was an angel of mercy, ending the suffering of terminally ill patients who were in pain. At other times, he admitted he killed patients who annoyed him, who were rude, who made too many demands, who were messy and created extra work for him. And at still other times, he seemed to kill simply because he could, because he enjoyed the power, because taking a life gave him a sense of control, in a life where he felt powerless. Psychologists who have studied Harvey describe him as a deeply damaged individual with a profound need for control and a complete lack of empathy. He saw patients not as people, but as objects, annoyances to be eliminated, problems to be solved, sources of inconvenience or fascination. And because he was an orderly, invisible, ignored, beneath the notice of doctors and nurses, he was able to operate with near total impunity. No one suspected the quiet man who cleaned the rooms and changed the sheets. No one imagined that the orderly was systematically murdering patients. Harvey's killing spree finally ended in 1987, when he made a mistake. He was working at Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati, and one of his victims was John Powell, a 44-year-old man who was recovering from a motorcycle accident. Powell wasn't elderly. He wasn't terminally ill. He was young, relatively healthy, and expected to make a full recovery. But Donald Harvey decided to kill him. The exact reason is unclear. Harvey later claimed Powell had been rude to him, had made unreasonable demands, had treated him like a servant rather than a healthcare worker. So Harvey mixed cyanide into Powell's orange juice and watched him drink it. Powell died shortly afterward. And because he was young, and his death was unexpected, doctors were suspicious. They ordered an autopsy and toxicology tests, and the tests came back positive for cyanide. The hospital immediately contacted the Cincinnati Police Department and the Hamilton County Coroner's Office. An investigation was launched, and investigators began looking at everyone who had access to Powell's room, who could have poisoned his food or drink. The trail led to Donald Harvey. When confronted by detectives, Harvey initially denied everything. But as the evidence mounted, witness statements, access logs, his presence in Powell's room around the time the poisoning occurred, Harvey realized he was caught. And in a stunning development, he confessed. Not just to killing John Powell, but to killing dozens of other patients over the course of his career. At first, Harvey claimed he had killed 15 people. Then, as investigators pressed him, the number grew. 20, 30, no soon, 50. Finally, Harvey confessed to killing 87 people, though he admitted the exact number was difficult to remember because there had been so many over so many years, and some of the deaths blurred together in his memory. 87 murders. It would make Donald Harvey one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, surpassed only by people like Charles Cullen and possibly a handful of others whose full body counts have never been confirmed. Investigators worked to verify Harvey's confessions. They exhumed bodies. They reviewed medical records. They interviewed hospital staff and families of victims. And they found that Harvey's confessions were credible. The details he provided matched the circumstances of the deaths. Toxicology tests on exhumed bodies confirmed the presence of poisons in cases where he claimed to have used them. But proving all 87 murders was impossible. Many of the bodies had been cremated. Medical records had been destroyed. And the sheer number of victims, spread across multiple hospitals over nearly 2 decades, made it logistically impossible to prosecute every case. Instead, prosecutors focused on the cases where the evidence was strongest. In 1987, Donald Harvey was charged with 37 counts of murder. He pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to multiple life sentences, totaling several hundred years in prison. At his sentencing, Harvey showed little emotion. He described his crimes in a detached, matter-of-fact manner, as if he were discussing routine hospital procedures rather than mass murder. He claimed that many of his victims had been suffering, that he had been acting out of mercy. But he also admitted that some of the victims had simply annoyed him, and he had killed them out of spite or convenience. The families of Harvey's victims were devastated. Many had believed for years that their loved ones had died natural deaths. They had mourned, grieved, and moved on. Learning that their family members had been murdered, poisoned by an orderly they had barely noticed, reopened old wounds and created new layers of trauma. Donald Harvey was sent to the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, where he was housed in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes. He spent nearly 3 decades in prison, largely isolated from the general population. But in March 2017, Harvey's killing spree finally caught up with him in an ironic twist. He was beaten to death by another inmate in his cell. The motive for the attack is unclear. Some reports suggest it was a dispute over the television. Others suggest the attacker simply wanted to kill a notorious serial killer. But regardless of the reason, Donald Harvey died violently, just as so many of his victims had. He was 64 years old. And with his death, the full truth of his crimes, the complete list of his victims, the methods he used, the motivations behind each killing, died with him. You might wonder how Donald Harvey was able to kill 87 people without being caught for so long. The answer lies in a combination of factors: the invisibility of his position, the vulnerability of his victims, the variety of his methods, and the assumptions people make about death in hospitals. First, Harvey was an orderly. He was part of the background, the furniture. Doctors and nurses didn't pay attention to him. Patients barely noticed him. He could enter rooms, handle food and medications, adjust equipment, and no one questioned what he was doing. Second, his victims were overwhelmingly elderly, sick, or terminally ill. When these patients died, it wasn't surprising. It was expected. And in the 1970s and 1980s, routine toxicology testing wasn't standard practice for every hospital death. Unless there was a specific reason to suspect poisoning, autopsies were cursory and toxicology tests were limited. Third, Harvey varied his methods. He didn't rely on a single poison or a single technique. He adapted to whatever was available, whatever would be least likely to arouse suspicion. This made it difficult for investigators to see a pattern, because each death looked different. And fourth, Harvey operated in an era before sophisticated monitoring systems, before electronic medication tracking, before the kind of statistical analysis that caught serial killers like Charles Cullen. The tools that might have detected Harvey's crimes didn't exist or weren't widely used during most of his killing spree. The orderly of death is a reminder that the most dangerous person in a hospital isn't always the doctor or the nurse. Sometimes, it's the person no one notices. The person who cleans the rooms, who brings the food, who adjusts the pillows, who moves through the hallways like a ghost. Donald Harvey held the power of life and death over vulnerable patients for nearly 2 decades. And he used that power to kill indiscriminately, using methods that ranged from the medieval suffocation to the modern HIV injection, from the subtle, slow poisoning to the brutal cyanide in orange juice. He claimed to be an angel of mercy, but angels don't kill out of spite. They don't murder patients who are rude. They don't poison people because they're messy or inconvenient. Donald Harvey was a serial killer who happened to work in hospitals. He found a profession that gave him access to vulnerable victims, that provided him with the means to kill, and that operated in an environment where his crimes could go unnoticed for years. The hospitals where Harvey worked, Marymount, the VA Medical Center, Drake Memorial, have all implemented changes since his arrest. Medication tracking has been improved. Access to dangerous substances has been restricted. And orderlies, once largely unsupervised, are now monitored more closely. But these changes came too late for the 87 people Donald Harvey killed. They came too late for the families who spent years believing their loved ones had died natural deaths, only to learn they had been murdered. Donald Harvey confessed to being one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. And he did it all while wearing the uniform of a hospital orderly, carrying a mop and a bucket, moving through the halls as if he belonged. Because he did belong. And that's what made him so dangerous. The orderly of death is gone now, beaten to death in a prison cell. But the legacy of his crimes, the 87 lives he took, the families he destroyed, the trust he shattered, remains. And the question that haunts everyone who studies his case is, how many other Donald Harveys are out there, moving through hospitals, invisible and unnoticed, holding the power of life and death over the patients in their care? We may never know. Hospitals are supposed to be sanctuaries. They're places where we go when we're at our most vulnerable, when we need help, when we're sick and scared and desperate for someone to make things better. We surrender ourselves to strangers, nurses and doctors and therapists and orderlies, and we trust them with our lives. We trust them because we have to. Because when you're lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to monitors and IV lines, unable to care for yourself, you have no choice but to trust that the person in the white coat or the scrubs or the uniform is there to help you. But as these 7 stories have shown, that trust can be betrayed in the most horrific ways imaginable. The next time you're in a hospital, whether as a patient, a visitor, or a healthcare worker, you'll think about these stories. You'll look at the nurse checking the IV and wonder, can I trust this person? You'll see the orderly cleaning the room and wonder, who are they really? You'll hear the alarm sound for a code and wonder, was this emergency manufactured? This has been Plain Sight Docs. If these stories have disturbed you, if they've made you think twice about the places and people we trust, then we've done our job. Subscribe and explore the crimes that hide in institutions, the horrors that wear uniforms, the dangers that operate in plain sight. Because the truth is out there, in the hospital wards, in the medication rooms, in the quiet hours of the night shift, waiting to be exposed. Which of these hospital crimes haunts you the most? Let us know in the comments. And remember, when you close your eyes in a hospital bed, when you surrender to sleep and trust that someone is watching over you, make sure you know who that someone is. Stay vigilant, stay aware, and never forget, the person in the white coat might be a healer, or it might be a killer. This is Plain Sight Docs. Until next time,